Have you ever been wronged by someone? I'm not talking about someone that cuts in front of you at a checkout line or getting to an exit on the highway, but rather someone who caused you lasting emotional turmoil, someone that really damaged a relationship that you had with them. Maybe a spouse or a close friend that betrayed your trust, or someone that said something very hurtful or disregarded you when you needed them. Maybe a coworker that undermined you in a meeting at work with your boss, or maybe even a church member that was hurtful to you and it really cut close. I would venture a guess, if I needed to, that just about everyone here has gone through something along one of those lines that I've just described. And humanly, when we encounter situations like this, usually there are about three courses of actions that people will take. They'll seek vengeance. They want their pound of flesh. Or they'll retaliate in kind. I'll give to you as good as you gave to me. Or they'll dismiss the action, but they'll never forget it. They'll hold it like a smoldering ember that just sits there. There is another solution, a more godly perspective that can repair relationships, or at the very least prevent them from getting any worse. So today we're going to take a look at different aspects of forgiveness. Forgiveness is an incredibly important biblical principle. So today we're going to take a look at our responsibility as Christians to be willing to forgive one another. If you'll turn to Matthew 18, we'll start there. Our goal in dealing with any disagreements we have is never to disagree to begin with. That we can be of such a mind that these things do not become contentions or divisions between us. So the context today is to discuss how we approach forgiveness when we do have it. In Matthew 18, we have a principle here, beginning in verse 21, of this matter of forgiveness. And from the Jewish culture, Peter thought he was being very generous. And he asks this question of Christ, "Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him?" It's a very good question, very insightful question. If I'm wronged, how many times should I go to my brother? He says up to 7 times, thinking that was very generous. And for a lot of people, that would be extremely generous. But Christ doesn't answer the way Peter thought he would. It's verse 22, it says, Jesus said to him, "I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. So he's using hyperbole here. It's not that we can count up to 490, and when we have 491st time, we can dismiss them. He's using an exaggeration here. To forgive as often as it takes, as often as you see they're trying. And so then we're left with this thought to apply it. If we go back up to verse 15, he's dealing with a brother that sinned against you and how we're to go to him. We're to have this conversation and we're to try to work these things out. Verse 20, if you look up just a little bit there, speaks to the unity that God seeks that we should have. When we're gathered together, that we're representing him and we're coming before him in that regard. And so then we come down to verse 35, if we move down into the chapter, and we have in between here the parable of the unforgiving servant. It's a very interesting parable. Master had come to a point where he realized that he had a servant who was cooking the books, if we want to use an expression. He was playing fast and loose with the resources of the master. The master figured it out, and he was going to call him into account. And so then the servant here pleads for mercy. Have patience with me, and I will restore all of this. And because he was so fervent in his request, and the master so merciful, he grants him that. If you look at the context of the cost, what the price was, what the dollar amount he was looking at here, it would have been an equivalent of today millions of dollars. So this must have been a very wealthy master. And yet he was willing to erase all of that debt. And so then, in the meantime, he then turns to a fellow servant who, by way of comparison, owed him maybe a couple $100. But he treats him with such vehemence, such disregard. Everything that he pleaded from his master in terms of mercy, he did the exact opposite to his fellow servant. And so then the master finds out. And he reverses course. Since you didn't appreciate what I gave you, what happened in your life, this great debt that was forgiven, I'm not going to continue doing that. So verse 35, Christ says, "So my heavenly Father also will do to you." In verse 34, the master turned this wicked servant over to torturers, not just to repay the debt. He was now going to pay a physical price for all that he stole. And Christ said God will do something similar. Notice, if each of you from your heart does not forgive his brother his trespasses. That's quite a standard to live up to, isn't it? Are we so willing to not forgive? Are we so entrenched in wanting, as I said earlier, either vengeance or retaliation, or we're going to hold on to this burning ember so much that we're willing to risk having the same thing brought back to us? If you have a marker and you want to hold your place here in Matthew, we'll be back in a little bit, but let's go next to Colossians chapter 3. I mentioned in my purpose statement that forgiveness is an incredibly important biblical principle. In fact, it speaks to our calling. And in Colossians 3, in verse 12, we're giving a statement here, a call to action, if you will, a purpose, a vision that we're supposed to have as we move forward in what God has called us to. So Colossians 3 and verse 12 simply says, "Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another, and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do." This can become very personal, can't it? What has Christ forgiven you for? I'm not looking for any testimonies here. But when we stop and consider what Christ has forgiven us for, do we extend that same mercy that we've received to other people? This here speaks to a requirement. We must do this, as it says at the end of verse 13. Again, quite a high standard. If you want to write Ephesians 4:32 in your notes, it says a very similar statement that we're to forgive one another. Again, a requirement. God does not endorse the thought that I have a right to be angry with so-and-so. It's not acceptable to him. But before we go any further, let's define what forgiveness is and what it is not. And I took these from an article written by a former UCG pastor, John Sephora, who wrote on forgiveness. He has since passed away. What forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not condoning or pardoning harmful behavior. Someone is sinning, we're not required to go to them, seek forgiveness, and then condone the sin if they're sinning. He says forgiveness is not healing the wound lightly when there is not peace. If the other party is not engaged in trying to establish peace, we're not required at that point to forgive. Not in the active sense of pretending that everything's okay. He continues and says, forgiveness is not an expectation of any degree of future relationship with the person who has perpetuated wrong behavior. Sometimes some things can be so egregious that we can forgive, but the relationship may be damaged forever. All right, what forgiveness is. There are two basic words in the Hebrew translated as forgive or forgiveness. They also mean to lift up, literally or figuratively. To lift up, to suffer, to bear with, or to carry away. There are two Greek words translated as forgive or forgiveness, and they mean also to forsake, to lay aside, to put away, or to grant favor or pardon. So, forgiveness involves the putting away of anger towards one another. Even when there is no change in behavior from the other party, where you're still required to forgive, bearing in mind these other things we've just touched on here. Forgiveness, again, involves putting away of anger towards another, putting it aside so that it no longer controls our lives. And this is huge. If the world would apply this, think of the wars, the contention, the divisions that would cease to exist. And whenever I think of this topic, I think of a famous expression that goes something like this. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison hoping the other person will die. It hurts us. Doesn't hurt the other person. In most cases, unfortunately, the other person doesn't even know we're upset. Here's the last aspect, what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is also allowing God to correct and make the situation right. We cannot change anyone. We have a hard enough time changing ourselves. And so if there is wrong behavior, if there is something that needs to be changed, if there is something that needs to be learned or seen, that has to be between them and God. Otherwise, we get wrapped up in someone else's sin. Paul tells us not to do that. Part of the difficulty is that realistically, we expect too much of others and not enough of ourselves. We grant ourselves all kinds of exemptions. We know what we meant, what we felt, what we thought. Usually we don't extend that to others. And as Mr. Sephoric mentioned, forgiveness does not necessarily imply or require reconciliation. There might be some things that have been so harmful, so hurtful, that it may take a lifetime to get to a point where you could interact with that person again. But it does require putting anger aside so that it no longer controls our lives. Let's look next at Matthew 7. Many people misapply this verse, and what they say is that we are to not judge any matter, and that's not what Christ is talking about. And so many, even in the greater Christian community, but certainly even those outside of that community that understand or know some scriptures, they will say, here, see, you're judging me. You're not supposed to judge me. Matthew 7, verse 1, judge not that you be not judged. Is that what it's saying? If we're not judging anyone, then there is no standard, isn't there? And that's unfortunately what many people are pointing to. They don't want any standards so that anything is acceptable, whatever they do. But that's not what he's saying. Notice verse 2. We don't judge because with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. How many people have been swept up as they condemn various behaviors? And even if they're right in condemning these behaviors, you find out later on they were engaged in the same behavior they were condemning. There's a different standard. If we're judging other people, then God's going to judge us by the same standard, and that's what he says. With the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. You want your pound of flesh? Better be willing to have it taken from you too. You want mercy? You better be willing to extend it. Because it speaks to our heart, our character. Verse 3, why do you look at the speck? This is more hyperbole. He's exaggerating here for a point. Why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye and do not consider the plank in your own eye? It's ridiculous, isn't it? You ever had an eyelash in your eye, a little piece of sand? Oh, you'll do everything to get that out, won't you? The pain, until it's gone. Your eye is watering, and even after you get it out, you can't see for a while because the tears just keep coming, the irritation. How can you have a plank in your eye and not know about it? But again, we forgive ourselves all kinds of things, don't we? He shows the ridiculous nature of this because then he says, how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? You're a hypocrite. First, remove the plank from your own eye. Deal with your own problems first, and then you'll be able to see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. This is pretty huge, isn't it? Part of forgiveness is recognizing that we have stuff we need to work on. Before we start pointing fingers, before we start meddling, or before we start holding grudges, that we address the matters we know we need to address. That plank that everybody else can see, but obviously we're blind to. Let's go back to the previous chapter, Matthew 6, verse 12, part of the model prayer, and consider just one aspect of this as well. It goes to Matthew 7 here. Matthew 6, verse 12, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. That as we come before God in prayer, one of the things that we're, told by Christ to remember is to ask for God to forgive us, but he predicates it. To what degree God does that depends on how we forgive others. I've had individuals at various times tell me that one thing or the other needs to be addressed relationships or aspects in a congregation or between two people or whatever, and they want the hard line. This person shouldn't come to church anymore. And I'll say, well, that may be, but are you willing to be held to the same standard? You know, you want an eye for an eye, you're going to have a kingdom of blind men, right? As the saying goes. I have a great story along this line. If you'll turn to Hebrews 12, I'll read it afterwards. But this story is taken from the book called The Last Years by Charles Flood. He recounts a story of Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, after the Civil War. He was in Kentucky. There was a woman that he was speaking to, and she had suffered great loss in the war. She took him to the remains of this huge, grand old oak tree that was in the front of her yard, and it was all mangled. It had been decimated by artillery fire, gunfire, and so forth, and now it was all broken. It was damaged, and she was complaining bitterly about all that had been destroyed, all that had been taken away. She waited for Lee to condemn the North, or for at least for him to sympathize with her loss. He looked at the tree and he paused for a moment, and then he said to her, "Cut it down, my dear madam, and forget it. It's better to forgive the injustices of the past than to allow them to remain. Let bitterness take root and poison the rest of our life." Hebrews 12 and verse 11. You're probably already there. Let me get there. Hebrews 12, verse 11. Now, no chastening seems to be joyful for the moment, for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterwards it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Therefore, strengthen the hands which hang down and the feeble knees, and make straight the paths for your feet, so that the lame may not be dislocated, but rather healed. The peaceable fruit. Pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. The peaceable fruit. Cut it down. Sometimes it's better to take the loss, realize it's never going to be the same again, and not allow that to continue to poison the rest of our life, as General Lee said. But in today's world, many nations, families, individuals, too many Christians, they're nursing a whole forest of oak trees that have been damaged, aren't they? It's amazing how many times in conversations things will come up and people will complain about something, and I'll ask, when did this take place? 1975, 1980, whatever. And it's like, seriously? How many Passovers have you sat in since then? You're still holding on to that? Let's go back to Exodus 34. The really sad thing is that in most cases, as I said earlier, the offending party, if they truly were the offending party, they're completely unaware. And in the meantime, this anger has taken root, as it says there in Hebrews, and it just yields bitter fruit. Have you ever eaten something that you thought was going to be sweet and it wasn't? My grandparents had a kumquat tree. Anybody know what a kumquat is? All right, a few of you do. They look like clementine oranges. They're small. They're about that size. So everybody thinks they're an orange. We used to love to bring these things back. And somebody would say, "Oh, a small orange, can I have one?" You wouldn't tell them it's a clementine. You wouldn't tell them it's a kumquat. So they'd peel this thing, they'd pop the whole thing in their mouth because it's small enough. It's as sour as a lemon. And you see this change in they're not what they expected. Exodus 34, and in verse 6. The Lord paused before him. This is Moses. He'd gotten angry when he went up on the mountain the first time. God told him to go down, look at what your people are doing. He got down there, he was so angry, he destroyed the tablets. He had to go back up. This time God made him make his own tablets. He gets up there, and the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the eternal God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering, and abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, and forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Forgiving iniquity. Where would each of us be if God refused to forgive us? This is why it's so important. This is why we read those earlier verses. Judge not lest you be judged. It means that God's going to look at us the same way we look at other people, how we hold them. Are we forgiving them? Are we holding on to our pound of flesh? We're waiting for God to strike them down. Let's go to Philippians 2, verse 5. This is not the mind. That mindset of the world is not what we're supposed to hold on to, not the perspective that we're supposed to have. We're supposed to have a different mind. Philippians 2 and verse 5. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Jesus Christ. What kind of mind did Christ have? How many times was he wronged? He grew up in a family that didn't understand for the most part. Perhaps his mother and father had a glimpse, but I can almost guarantee you his siblings probably thought he was the weirdest brother they ever knew. Crazy. He gets old enough. He's maligned by the leadership. Any good act he did, they ascribed to something evil. Everywhere he turned, at the very end of his life, everybody he thought was close to him, with the exception of his mother, his aunt, and his good friend John, left him. Could he have held on to hurts? He had every reason, justification that he could have. But rather, he didn't. And that's the mind we're supposed to have, a mind of forgiveness, that as he was dying, he asked God to forgive them. Let's go back to Proverbs 17. The best way to stop contention? Proverbs 17 gives us the answer. Verse 14. Proverbs 17, verse 14. The beginning of strife is like the releasing of water. Have you ever been to a dam and they open the gates? My brother was telling me this past spring down in Tulsa, the Arkansas River was at the highest it's ever been. And most of the lakes along the Arkansas, in one way or another, is because they've created these dams. They've backed up the water. They did a lot of that for flood control over the years. They had so much water this past year, they opened every gate on those dams, and it could not let the water through fast enough. Once you do that, how easy is it to close that off? Not very easy at all. You have to wait for the water to go down. There's just a tremendous amount of pressure and power behind it. And God here says that strife is like that. It's like the releasing of water. You've opened up something you're not going to turn around very easily. So he says, therefore, stop contention before a quarrel starts. Stop it before it even gets that far. If we've been baptized for any length of time, we should be able to start to discern when those things happen, that it's not going to go well, that we leave a matter that's going to grow into something else. We try to repair it before it becomes broken, these sort of things. Let's go back to Luke 15. This is the story of the prodigal son, and there's just so much in this story. You have to wonder why the son was compelled to leave to begin with. There was something disconnected there in that family between the father and him, between his brother and him. There's also contention between the brother that stayed in the father. But to me, it's a story of forgiveness. Luke 15, and we'll pick it up in verse 11. And he says, a certain man had two sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me. The portion of goods wasn't due to him until his father died. We're given no indication here. His father's in failing health. He's old. He's infirmed. It's a matter of a couple of years. This seems to be when the son is young. He doesn't want to wait. So he says, give it to me now. Verse 13, not many days after that, the younger son gathered together and journeyed to a far country, gathered all together, journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions with prodigal living. The money seems endless when you have enough of it initially, right? Buying drinks and taking everybody out to dinner and paying all the expenses for everybody else. You've got a lot of friends when you got money. But verse 14, when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in the land, and he began to be in want. Suddenly he has no money, no friends, nobody helping him out. So it says, verse 15, he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. The lowest job possibly that he could find. You ever been around pigs? You could wash pigs from now until the end of time, and you will not keep them clean. They are filthy animals. They will root everything. If you're not careful, they'll eat each other. They're awful individuals or animals, but they serve a purpose. You can feed them anything. So they're living garbage disposals. My grandfather said that when he was a boy, they always turned the pigs out with the cows, because when the cows would go down to the creeks and ponds, the pigs would eat the snakes. Even if the snakes bit them, the poison wouldn't go anywhere, just the venom. It would just sit right under their skin. But he said the pigs love the snakes. It's just like spaghetti. Just slurp them up. There's a visual for you. This is his job. You know, it's not pleasant smelling stuff he's feeding the pigs. It's rotting food and vegetation and scraps. And this is how bad it got, verse 16. He would have gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that swine ate. This is how desperate and hungry he was. And no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he had an epiphany, a moment of clarity, and he said, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough to spare, and I perish with hunger? I spent everything he had, but I could still go back and work for him, and I would be better off than I am now. So he does. He says, I will arise and go to my father. I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. This was his plan. So he sets off. He arose, he went to his father, but when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion. What was his father doing? Did he sit there every day, praying, hoping his son would come back, looking at the horizon? Maybe today is the day. His father could have been angry at him. Look at all he wasted. We have no idea what money he gave to him, what resources, but it's all gone now. A life's work gone. He wasn't thinking about that. He was yearning for his son to come back. And when he sees him far off, it says he ran and he fell on his neck and he kissed him. And the son said to him what he had rehearsed in his mind. Father, I've sinned against heaven and your sight and no longer worthy to be called your son. And the father cuts him off there. He doesn't even get to say the rest of his rehearsed speech. The father interrupts and calls his servants and says, bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf here and kill it. Let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and he's alive again. He was lost and he's found. And they began to make merry. Whatever contentions, whatever disagreements, whatever lack of forgiveness the two of them had, it's gone. The father was so happy to see him again. Maybe he thought he would never, ever see him again. But all's not well. Verse 25. His older son was in the field, and as he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. A party's going on. What's going on? So he called one of the servants, and he asked, what does all this mean? And the servant said, your brother has come, because he has received him safe and sound. Your father has killed the fatted calf. Now we've opened a whole nother can, haven't we? The brother's not very happy at all. Verse 28, he was angry. Why is he angry? He still had his inheritance coming. We'll see here in a moment. His father still says, you've got everything I have. A fatted calf is going to take something away, so there's probably some contention between the brothers. He was angry, and he wouldn't even go in. So his father had to come out and pleads with him and says, look, all these years, the son says, I've been serving you. I've never transgressed your commandment. I've been the good son. Why have you treated this bad son so well? You've never given me a goat that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon, notice, as this son of yours, I don't claim it at all. This son of yours who has devoured your livelihood with harlots, you've killed the fatted calf for him. And so the father says, son, you're always with me. You have everything I have. It was right that we should make merry and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive again and lost and found. If I could paraphrase this and take license with the story, I would say it's time to forgive him. We don't have the ending of that story. But let me read to you again from the article from Mr. John Sephoric, as he wrote on forgiveness, to remind you what I stated earlier. Forgiveness does not necessarily imply or require reconciliation. The brother had no obligation to pretend that nothing had ever happened, that he wasn't upset, but the anger wasn't justified. The money that the son wasted was not his money, it was his father's, to give him and do what he will. Let's go to Colossians 1 again. Forgiveness should bring reconciliation. Please don't misunderstand. It should. As Christians, we should seek reconciliation, a restoring to whatever degree it can be. We should seek that. But it is not all up to us, is it? We could forgive someone, and the other party may not be there yet, may not want to be ever. But what is up to us is forgiveness. Our forgiveness is never dependent upon the other person. Colossians 1 and verse 14. Speaking of Christ, he says, "In whom we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins." The interesting thing about Christ's forgiveness of our sins is that he died for that before any of us were even alive. He knew that there would be a disconnect from the sins that we would commit. But he did that for all of mankind, not just for us. He wanted the relationship restored. He wanted reconciliation with all of mankind. And so he was willing to go through what he did. The redemption through his blood. He didn't have to do that. They didn't have to do any of this. They were happy, the God beings. They could have lived, what expression do we, they could have lived forever without having us. But they wanted to expand their family, and they're willing to put up with some of this in the meantime so that we can learn and grow and become like them. But again, it speaks to this reconciliation that we have through Christ. What are we not willing to forgive? And would we ask God to forgive the same thing in us? We're all weak, aren't we? We're human, we're carnal. We have moments of anger and frustration, whatever it happens to be. But God tells us to forgive and cover those sins of others, especially when someone is sorry, especially like this prodigal son we just read about. He knew that he had wasted everything. He said, "I've sinned against you in heaven." If we truly love God and our neighbor, then we'll have that same spirit of forgiveness. Let's go to Colossians 3, page or so over. Colossians 3, verse 13. And let's reread this. We read this earlier. "Bearing with one another and forgiving one another." We're supposed to be a new person upon baptism. Nothing irritates me more than for someone to say, "Well, that's just who I am. I don't care." We're not supposed to be just who we are. We're supposed to become like Christ. This is so important, as I said in my statement purpose. Let's go back to Matthew 5. It's so important that God said, in essence, if you realize you've got a problem with one of your brothers, stop whatever you're doing, even coming before me. Go do what you can to reconcile that. Let's read this. Matthew 5 and verse 21. "You have heard it said to those of old, 'You shall not murder.'" That's the commandment. "And whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment." Verse 22, "But I say to you," notice how he expands the meaning of the law here into the spirit of the law. "But I will say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without cause." And the problem we have humanly is that we all say, "Well, I'm justified," right? I have reason to be angry. That's not what Christ is talking about here. He says, whoever is angry with his brother without cause shall be in danger of the judgment as well. It's no different than if you've killed that person. This is how serious it is. "And whoever says to his brother, 'Raka,' which is a term of derision, shall be in danger of the council, but whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be in danger of hellfire." So notice verse 23. "Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar," we come before God. In this application, they would have been coming to the temple, but for you and me, it's any time we're coming before God. If you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, there's something that's been broken in that relationship. We've offended each other, whatever it happens to be. Verse 24, "Leave your gift before the altar, go your way. First be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. That's pretty serious, isn't it? It doesn't negate the obligations we have in coming before God. He says you don't have to do it. No, what he says is stop. That's more important. Why is that more important? Because it reflects what God is. He's not broken. He's not disconnected. He doesn't have these contentions and these divisions in relationships. And he says that has to be resolved before you can come before me. When it speaks to anger here, back up in verse 22, the meaning of the Greek word there is rage. Have you ever seen someone so angry that their countenance changes? Maybe they're so vocal in that anger, their whole face just turns red. The emotion has just taken a hold of them and run forward. This is what it's talking about. That anger should never be focused on a person. It might be focused on an attitude, but we have to be very careful with anger. God says not to let the sun go down on your anger, because it will simmer, it will seethe. You might remember 2 Chronicles 7:14. That's the verse where God says, if my people will do this and this, then I will forgive. God is looking for us, not only to have the relationship we're supposed to have with him, but he's looking for us to have that same forgiveness. Let's go back to Proverbs 15:1. There's a great proverb here. How do you deal with contention again? We read the proverb earlier that speaks to this, but there's another way here. Proverbs 15, verse 1, a soft anger turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. What is one of the worst things you can do when there's contention between two people? Escalate the behavior. Somebody starts yelling at me, I'm going to start yelling back. They start threatening me, I'm going to start threatening them. And then it just goes from there, doesn't it? This is another key to not letting this get ahead of us. A soft answer. I mean, if you only think of it this way, it'll play with their head. They won't know what to do if they're screaming at you and you whisper back. They have to stop in their anger to listen, don't they? But the whispering aspect, the soft answer, is not just doing that. It's that you don't mimic the behavior. You don't continue what's creating the contention. A soft answer. Maybe the soft answer is, I'm sorry. You want to take a lot of heat off of a situation? Those 3 words. Maybe the soft answer is saying, what can I do to fix it? We have examples along these lines in Scripture. Look at David with Nabal. David was in the wilderness trying to stay a step ahead of Saul, that he wouldn't be killed. He has a band of men with him. They're not raiding, they're not pillaging, they're protecting the southern borders of the people in Israel. Nabal was one of them. Along the course of what they were doing, they protected his flocks, they protected his servants. They were hungry, and David went and said, look, we've helped you in this way, can you help us? And you know what Nabal did? He was very disrespectful, very dismissive. David was so angry, he was going to kill everyone in that family. And you know David, he would have done it. Nabal's wife gets hint of this. She loads up the supplies. She rides off to intercept David and pleads for her family's life. She says, don't let this happen. Let God take care of it. And God did, didn't they? A few days later, Nabal dies. David didn't have to do anything. He forgave Nabal in that moment. We have the example of Paul being all things to all men. Look at how many opportunities he had to be angry. How many times he went with the perfect intentions of teaching these people God's word, offering them to help, to point them to what God wanted in their lives. Jail and stoning. I had 4 brothers. I have a hint what stoning is like. It was smaller stones, but we weren't adverse to throwing that at each other. Why is it easier to not forgive than to forgive? Why is it we want to go on poking at people, as I said earlier, that eye for eye, instead of looking at them in the eye for a solution? I have a reference or a comment here I want to read to you from Tim LaHaye in his book, Anger is a Choice. I'm not necessarily a proponent of Tim LaHaye. I just thought this was an insightful comment. Why is it easier not to forgive? He says, forgiveness is very costly. It costs you, not the person forgiving. Forgiveness means that justice will not always be fulfilled. Forgiveness does not rebuild the house that's been burned down by someone carelessly playing with matches. Forgiveness does not always put a broken marriage back together. Forgiveness does not restore virginity to the rape victim. Forgiveness is letting go. That's what General Lee said, wasn't it? Let it go. Forgiveness is the relaxation of your death grip on the pain you feel. And then he quotes Archibald Hart. He said, gave a poignant conclusion to the matter, that forgiveness is surrendering my right to hurt you back if you hurt me. Forgiveness is surrendering my right to hurt you back if you hurt me. Remember what we read in Matthew 18, 7 times 70? That's the application. And then another quote of a section of a book from Dave Pelzer titled Help Yourself. I'll tell you why this is important after I read the excerpt here. He says, forgiveness is letting go. Again, repeating that thought. It is saying, I will not become like you. He says, we know through tests that you can sleep better, have higher levels of intimacy, and levels of trust when you forgive. He says, when I was able to forgive my mom, I was really able to let more people in. If you want to read the story of Dave Pelzer, you'll find out that he grew up in an incredibly abusive home, suffering at the hand of his mother. Let's go to John 13. How will the world know that we are the people of God? Is it going to be the pain and the hurt and the wrongs that we hold on to? Is it going to be extracting our pound of flesh and getting even? Is it going to be anything like that? Or is it going to be rather what Christ said in John 13, verse 35? John 13, verse 35, Christ says, by this all men will know that you are my disciples. Here, how the world will know when we say we are Christian, if we have love one for another. That love is not a casual love. That love is sacrifice. That love is serving. That love is forgiving. If you go over a page or so to John 15, verse 12, John records this of Christ. This is my commandment, Christ said, that you love one another as I have loved you. Again, considering what Christ did for us. He said, this is my commandment, that you have that same love. Verse 13, greater love has no one than this. You want to see the pinnacle of what godly love is? He says, greater love has no one more than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. Even if someone else is not willing to be part of repairing a relationship, of restoring and forgiving and doing all the things that they should, we should. That's love. When someone else is not returning in kind and we still do it, that's godly love. So let me give you just a few practical ways before I conclude here. Take a brief look at some ways to deal with anger and forgiveness. Point number 1, make sure you have the facts concerning the problem. Matthew 18, the first one, to plead a case. We tend to believe the first thing we hear, don't we? Make sure you have the whole story. We may get ourselves all wound up, and it's not even what we think it is. Make sure you have the facts concerning the problem. Number 2, pray for wisdom and understanding of the problem. James 1:5. If any of you lacks wisdom, what should I do with this? What can I fix? What can I not fix? What do I need to let go? Pray for wisdom and understanding of the problem. Number 3, try to put yourself in the other person's shoes. 1 Corinthians 9:19 through 22. Maybe they're just having a bad day, and there's nothing personal about it. And it does not excuse a hurt, but it may help to understand why they're off. Maybe someone just chewed them out for nothing. Maybe someone did something to them at work, or they've encountered a huge problem. Maybe they just got handed the worst possible news they could ever get, and they don't know how to cope with this yet. Try to put yourself in the other person's shoes. Maybe there's something there to help with, to encourage. Number 4, approach the situation with humility. Could we do the same thing they're doing? Maybe we're already doing that with someone else. If we have humility, Matthew 7, we'll pause, we'll think, well, maybe I need to consider how I'm judging this. Number 5, be willing to see any fault of your own in the matter and be willing to change. Sometimes the things that irritate us the most in other people are the things that we need to deal with. We see our problem in someone else. We're blind to it, but it irritates us. Everybody else is looking at both people and wondering why they don't see it. Maybe the problem is that we're just like that. Number 6, be gracious and receptive to the views and responses of the other person. Be gracious and receptive to the views of the other person. You go to that person, you say, look, what you said, what you did really hurt. And the other person may say, I'm sorry. What are you going to do with that? Are you going to let it go? The other person may say, I don't care. Are you going to let that go? No matter what it is, be gracious and receptive. Verse 7, be bold enough to seek to resolve the matter. It is amazing how much of a history we have as God's people where we will not go to our brother to try to resolve something. We'll go to everybody else. We'll keep it internalized. We'll stuff it down until it just blows up at some point in the future. But go seek to resolve the matter. Just perchance it might work. The person might say, I'm sorry. I didn't know that I said it that way. I didn't intend it that way. What can I do? Okay, you've gained a brother. At the very least, you've done what God said to do. You've laid your gift aside at the altar. You went and you tried to repair it. Let me conclude with one final story. In the final days of the Civil War, someone approached President Lincoln, and they asked him what he would do when the South had been defeated and forcibly returned to the Union. The writing was on the wall by 1864, the later months. Everyone knew it was just a foregone conclusion. They were just wrapping everything up. So this person was looking for a vengeful response. We'll punish them, we'll do X and Y, and we'll make them pay and these sort of things. And he was dumbfounded when President Lincoln replied, I will treat them as if they've never gone away. I never wanted this to begin with, he said, basically saying, I'll treat them as if they never went away. So how can we as Christians who have been forgiven so much ever justify not forgiving someone else? Forgiveness, again, is an incredibly important biblical principle. In fact, it is a salvation issue. Are we willing to practice Matthew 18 and forgive one another?